England's villages, with ancient churches, a pub lunch, and cricket on the green. It's a picture postcard identity of a nation, a snapshot of England that's recognised across the globe. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by the places where we live and how they've evolved over time.
For me, the story of our villages from the Normans to the present day is not one of sleepy rural idylls. It's a story of purpose and power. I'm in Warkworth, Northumberland, quaint and beautiful at first sight, but all of this was born of terror, oppression, and a foreign invasion. And it's here we'll find clues to the origins of many of our villages.
Warkworth has all the telltale features of a village with Norman origins. The castle, church, marketplace, and single main street. But what exactly is a village?
I was born and raised in a village, and we've all got a pretty good idea of what a village is, but actually it's quite difficult to define. The dictionary just says somewhere that's larger than a hamlet, but smaller than a town.
To really understand a village, we need to find out how it all started. And in Warkworth, you can find clues that go right back to 1066. I'm having a snoop down this narrow back lane because there are echoes of daily village life that hark back to those Norman French invaders.
Come on, girls. Come on.
Today's villagers are doing precisely what their predecessors were doing close to 1,000 years ago. All this time, these plots of land have been producing fruit, vegetables, and even honey. Beekeeping was popular in Norman times, and Warkworth resident John Hawborough is keeping that tradition alive. But the link to the Norman past lies not merely in the produce, but the shape and very name of these plots.
These down there, they've been a little bit lively, but don't worry, I've not brought them up, so you're safe.
Good. Now, interesting bit of land this, thin and long.
Yep. From the house to the river, I suspect you could get into 200 metres, maybe a bit more. And there would have been a burgage plot for each of the houses.
Burgage plot, that's interesting, because that's a very old name, and it refers to a plot of land for a town dweller. The French would have been very familiar with that, bourgage.
Yeah, so people come along and they'd walk along the ember path there, and they look at it and they say, what on earth are these? Are these allotments? You say, no, these are burgage plots. And there's, 77 of them. People rented them in medieval times, so they could look after themselves, get their own food, be independent.
These burgage plots are a legacy of deliberate planning following the conquest. The Normans had seized all the land from the English. If you wanted a piece back, you could have it, but the new masters decided its exact shape and size and set the price.
So if the Lord came looking for your honey...
I'd open the hive and let him get it himself.
Even before the invasion of 1066, the peasant population worked the land in servitude to their English masters. But the Normans took this feudal system to a whole new level. The Bayeux tapestry vividly depicts William I's conquest, but it tells us little of how he divided up England amongst his fellow nobles. These barons controlled everything, down to the smallest detail. Valerie and Gillian's plot is part of a very regular pattern. The Warkworth burgages are nearly all the same width.
That's about as far as my arm goes. We've still got another foot to go.
OK. What sort of measurement have you got?
26 and a half.
26 and a half.
As far as I could stretch.
So 27, 28 feet. That sort of measurement keeps cropping up again and again and again. Someone's laid all this out. There's a plan to it.
Definitely, yes. Yeah, so everybody was getting the same amount.
This early part of the village layout didn't evolve naturally. These regimented plots are a symbol of power and control. The Normans were leaving their indelible mark on the landscape and on the people they conquered. Wherever you are in Warkworth, it's obvious who's in control.
The castle towers over the village, affording total domination to the invaders. They spoke a completely different language, Norman French, so the conquest was psychological as well as physical. But Warkworth was at the very far reaches of their new empire, and the Northumbrians resisted for quite some time. Chris Kilkenny has written about those violent early decades following the conquest.
The Northumbrians were particularly stroppy people and used to being independent. And what would happen was, every time William appointed an earl, the Northumbrians murdered them. By and large, by chasing them into churches, setting the church alight, and then lopping off their heads as they came out with a 5-foot battle axe.
So it actually took a very long time for this part of the world to become under full Norman control.
It took about 100 years before we actually get a named Baron of Warkworth, who was Roger Fitzrichard.
And surprisingly few Normans actually controlling a vast area.
Well, they reckoned that there was about 400 Normans in Northumberland at that time, but a handful of people could dominate the rest by the building of castles. That was the essential stroke of Norman genius.
The early castles were made of wood, constructed on top of massive earth mounds. You can see this even more clearly at nearby Elsdon. The motte, the conical turf mound, was topped with a wooden keep. The adjoining bailey had timber fortifications to protect more buildings within. The outnumbered Normans built hundreds of these motte and bailey castles to subjugate the English, and in Warkworth it certainly did the trick.
Building this castle here was a bit like parking a massive tank right in the centre of the community.
Indeed it was. The English were looking up to the French lord. Whether he was on his horse or in his castle, the English looked up, and the French quite nicely looked down on the English. The good thing about it was you could actually get the locals to build it for you. And when it was finished, you had a structure here which you could not possibly capture. This could be held by 20 armed men.
The Normans left another classic village landmark in Warkworth. At the opposite end to the castle, the Church of St. Lawrence. It was built in the early 1100s. The tower and spire were added later. This architecture was unfamiliar to the native population, but they did at least share the same Christian beliefs as their new masters. The occupiers tightened their grip by appointing their own clergy and building impressive new churches in which to worship. Christine Shield is the local curate, and pretty much everywhere you look inside her church, that Norman heritage is unmistakable.
It's absolutely fabulous. We love it, but it is big and it takes a lot of keeping.
Yeah. But look at all this lovely Romanesque Norman architecture. A complete Norman west wall there. That is astounding. I mean, this is like stepping back into Norman times. It's incredible.
It is.
People would have admired this architecture in the way that we're admiring it today. There's those scalloped capitals, all these windows, those round-headed arches.
Like that?
And big as well.
And the longest nave in Northumberland. Always have to prep my brides for walking down this nave. It's a long walk.
Oh, and the crowning glory, this chancel arch.
Yes, you might have to go to Durham Cathedral to see anything as beautiful as that.
And the rib vaulting there.
The
in
rib
chancel.
vaulting is just beautiful. It's absolutely stunning.
All that great zigzag, that's, again, that's
perfect.
just so Norman, isn't it?
Perfect.
So not only do we know that the church was definitely here in Norman times, you actually know who was worshipping here, who was preaching here.
We do. We actually have a list of preachers going back to 1110. And the first one is Richard de Aurier-Vallée, very French-sounding, very Norman name.
Yeah.
We have a continuum right up until today.
What does it feel like to be part of that story?
That is a great privilege. It is a great privilege, and it's a wonder to worship in this building. It's beautiful. But you know, it goes back even further than that. There'll be a cross here that I bet you haven't spotted, and it's right there. And it marks the site of an earlier church, a much earlier church.
Foundations of a Saxon church
Underneath
right here.
it.
Amazing.
It is amazing. And even better, these large crosses, which again are dated Saxon, and they were dug up when they were excavating around the building.
Just small fragments, but
Yes.
what they tell us is that there was a community here or worship here before the Normans came.
A community, but was it anything like the village we see today? Frustratingly, the reference book that could tell us was written before the Normans had managed to subdue rebellious Northumberland.
In many parts of the country, we have the Domesday Book, and that actually tells us something about what was going on before the Normans in a village. Here we don't have that.
No, we don't, do we? They weren't in control here, so they didn't. We don't have a Domesday Book, which makes life difficult.
Colm O'Brien from Newcastle University is trying to shed light into this historical black hole. The earliest reference is from a religious chronicle that mentions the Ville of Warkworth.
This word that we get in the documents is not village, but villa in Latin, which translated into English as ville. It refers to the settlement or the settlements and the land immediately around it. There are outlying settlements around that render their produce, the produce of the land, to the estate centre here. So church, home farm, outlying settlements is the model we're looking at.
What we can say is that there was nothing like the village that came later.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And Colm has noticed another clue suggesting today's village was established after the conquest.
There's something odd about the castle in relation to this village,
It's
is there
sort
not?
of...
You spotted it.
Yes, it's sort of the wrong way round.
It's the wrong way round.
It doesn't face the village.
It's the wrong way round, yeah, that's right. It turns its back on the village. The entrance is right round the other side. Now that, to me, suggests the castle is here before the village.
So it would appear the castle wasn't looking to an existing settlement. Warkworth's timeline is this. The Normans built a castle as a stronghold. Only later did they follow their well-established practice of gathering the scattered local population into a single place where they could be more easily managed. It's a classic Norman village layout.
You get a real sense of Norman power at play here. The Lord of the Manor up there in the castle, the Lord Almighty down here in the church, and the villagers stuck in the middle. Just imagine the impact on the locals. Not only had the Normans introduced Norman French as the new language, but they'd transformed the skyline. Their control was as rigid as their new stone buildings. They were sending a powerful message. We're here to stay.
That meant organising the village so it could thrive. It needed an economic centrepiece. Right in the heart of Warkworth, a cross stands on the spot of the ancient market. Dr. Alex Brown from Durham University says it's all part of the Norman master plan.
This would be a very deliberate establishment by the Lord of the Manor, and the map really helps us see that. So if we open it up here, we have the broadening out of this road here that we're on, and then a really broader area here in front of the church. And this whole area may have originally been an open plan area. There'd be smells and sights and sounds. You'd have livestock wandering around everywhere. You'd have the hot foods of the medieval period, kind of fast food. You'd have pies and pastries. You'd have people wandering around with baskets through this whole area, selling fish or butter or cheese, hawking their wares, trying to get people's attention.
This wasn't just to create a shopping experience for the locals, there was a hard economic purpose to it all.
Exactly, the Lord of the Manor wanted tolls. This is all about taxation.
So everyone's a winner. If the market's thriving, the tolls are coming in, the Lord's getting rich, the people have got provisions, everyone's happy.
Exactly, and this is one of the reasons why Warkworth survives and grows in this period. It has the castle, it has the church, but there are lots of deserted medieval villages around Warkworth. And one of the reasons that they're deserted and Warkworth isn't is partly because of the marketplace, that it can draw people in a way that those other villages can't.
But the village was more than just its urban centre. That's where the community lived, but they worked in the surrounding countryside. Agriculture was the key industry. For the peasants, it was tough, hard labour, a world away from today's farming.
The style of farming in those days would be a style that would be familiar to my great-grandfather, but it's not something that I'd wish to do myself.
I'm off to explore those ancient methods, still visible in Bill Dodd's fields.
I can see why you've brought me here, Bill. You've got ridge and furrow.
Or rig and furrow, as we
Rig
call
and
it.
furrow, yes, I've got to get that right. In the northeast, it's rig, not ridge. And yeah, it's these gentle undulations, this sort of corrugated effect in the field, and caused by the plough in medieval times just going back and forth, throwing it up into a mound. I mean, I can imagine a team of oxes dragging the plough up there, the ploughman spurring them on.
It still works to this day. The water drains down the furrows into that ditch. You can see where the reeds are.
It's extraordinary that they're cultivating land that you're not cultivating now.
No, it doesn't lend itself to modern agricultural techniques. Obviously, the ground's so steep, you can't plough it.
Yeah. But they were ploughing
But
it.
they were,
They
yes.
were going up and down with these ox teams. I mean, imagine that.
Large parts of rural England still bear the old scars. Back in nearby Elsdon, traces of the rig and furrow earthworks reveal the vast area around a village that was brought into production. As well as labouring in the Lord's fields, the peasants grew their own crops on communal land. This way of working was around before the Normans, but they tightened their grip on this form of agriculture, which was ideally suited to the feudal system. And while the villagers toiled, their master played.
This is the remains of the park pale. This was the fence that delineated the medieval deer park.
So a big fence running in this direction. I can see it turned a corner and ran up the hill there, enclosing this park area.
Yeah.
And the parks were tremendously important. I mean, only the Lord could have these. It's where he kept his deer. It was a sort of game reserve, not for the general population, not for the villagers.
Absolutely not. It would be a fate worse than death if you were caught poaching
Well,
here.
I think a fine is the least you could expect. I think repeat offenders, it was mutilation, fingers cut off, blinded. Pretty horrific, really. All this heritage, all this history.
I love it. My family have farmed here for generations, but we don't own it. It's still owned by the guy who owns the castle up there.
And that's the 12th Duke of Northumberland, whose family arrived in England with the Norman conquest. Warkworth has been in the Percy family for 700 years. They built the stone castle we see today and emblazoned the keep with their emblem, the Percy lion, which stares down on the village below. They also gave Warkworth a curiosity that no other English village can match, and it's only accessible by boat. A hermitage carved deep into the rock face.
Good grief. This is amazing. Look at the workmanship. This is incredible. The exact origins of the hermitage are obscure, but we do know it was the Percys that paid for priests to worship here in this private chapel. And it shows the importance of religion to carve this wonderful place from the sandstone rock. It also shows the importance and influence of the Percys on the village.
Their ancestral home is now a few miles away at Alnwick Castle, where the Duke's archivist Chris Hunwick can demonstrate how Warkworth has always been in Norman hands, from the conquest to the present day.
This is a royal confirmation of 1331 of the grant to Henry de Percy of Alnwick of the Lordship of Warkworth. It's under the Great Seal of Edward III,
Why is the king giving all this to the Percys?
The last baron got into financial difficulties, and the king is keen that it's an established family that has that possession.
Because the Percys go all the way back.
They're of direct Norman descent. They came over at the conquest. And indeed, they go on to become Earls of Northumberland, their power increases, and later, in the 18th century, the Dukes of Northumberland. And the present Duke of Northumberland today is still Baron of Warkworth.
The archives also contain a real treasure that helps us to understand how the village evolved. It's the earliest known map of Warkworth and dates back to the Gunpowder Plot, when the 9th Earl was suspected of treason.
His constable of Warkworth Castle was one of the principal conspirators.
Of course, yes.
The Earl could not prove his innocence, and he spent nearly 17 years in the Tower of London with a £30,000 fine hanging over his head. And so this great surveying exercise was in order to raise the income from his estates.
It's incredible. These traumatic events have led to this beautiful map and the first mapping of Warkworth.
It's a beautiful item, and I'm going to leave you to have a closer look at it.
Thank you. There's an awful lot of detail here. It is absolutely splendid. I can see the park, Warkworth Park, the Lord's Deer Park, with its paling fence circling round it. Helpfully, it's colour-coded. The green is very definitely under the Lord's control. The rent money is coming from these lands. That's where he's trying to raise revenue. The yellow is described as waste. It's sort of common land, actually quite useful land for the villagers, a bit of pasture, they could do a bit of digging there. But very interesting, the burgage plots are white. That's not under the Lord's control at all. The burgage plots were no longer paying rent to the Lord of the Manor. But well before the map was drawn up in 1624, Warkworth was being referred to as a borough, a status that bestowed special privileges on the burgage holders. They could vote and stand for local office. Tony Cuthbert grows prize vegetables in his plot. It's been in his and wife Barbara's family since the 18th century. And those ancient privileges brought results.
My great-great-grandfather, George, he was actually voted the mayor of Warkworth.
The leading citizen.
The leading citizen of the village. Quite a wealthy family. It's not now, but it was quite a wealthy family in those days.
In times gone by, he'd have been known as the borough reeve. That was a sort of medieval equivalent, but a very, very important person in the running of the place. And the important thing is, they had land. They had a burgage plot.
Absolutely.
We've got some documentation here that's been handed to Tony's mother, and it's been stored in the attic in this fantastic old biscuit box.
Oh, yes. Oh, good Lord, look at that. But the crux of it seems to be £25 is changing hands here.
Yes.
That's quite a lot of money in 1751.
Yes, it is.
£25. And that's for this plot. Yes, it says burgage and tenement here. And that money, it's not just buying any old plot of land, it's buying those rights to become a player in the village. The borough reeve was elected at a court leet. These were established by the Norman barons to run village affairs and dispense justice. Anyone with a burgage plot was obliged to serve in these courts. Pupils at Warkworth Primary School have been learning all about them.
I am the steward, appointed by the Baron of Warkworth, and his court is now in session. We are the jury made up of Warkworth villagers who have a burgage plot.
The jury also investigates crime. We decide if villagers are guilty or innocent, and we decide how to punish them.
I am Nicholas Crawford, and I have been fined for allowing my pigs to stray in my neighbour's corn crop.
I am Catherine French, accused of beating Barnaby Boyd with a ladle and drawing blood, but I was found not guilty.
I'm Eleanor Swan, and I've been a nuisance to my neighbours again and again. I've been fined 16 shillings and 8 pence. If I don't mend my ways, the constable has been told to put me in the ducking stool.
These are real individuals, real crimes, real punishments. There must have been a rowdy lot around here. It's like horrible histories for Warkworth.
The juries also appointed bread weighers and the village ale and flesh tasters, an ancient form of trading standards.
We don't know when Warkworth's first court leet was held, but that Norman tradition survived until 1926, when the last one met here in this pub. By then it was a largely ceremonial affair, and this is believed to be the final lineup. Borough Reeve, constables and all.
Homes on the main street have been rebuilt many times over the centuries, yet they remain true to the width of the Norman burgage plots behind. That's led to some interesting design features still common to many of Warkworth's houses, a front and back door that are in perfect alignment. Peter Thompson's home reveals why.
What on earth's going on in here?
This is a stable. Could get 2 horses in.
Yeah.
And the manger for putting the hay and the oats. And we've got a cow byre and get 3 cows in the byre. And also had a pigsty and hens.
You're right on the main street front here, but you've got a farm right in the middle of it, essentially.
Yeah. There was no access at the back, so the animals would come in the front. The passageway through the house is on a slope, so they could swill it out periodically after the animals had come through. And there's a photograph to prove it.
Oh, my goodness. And it's not an April Fool's?
No.
That's amazing. And this is the same house in that photograph. Local folklore has it that each cow knew exactly which door to go to. The same village design that created these cow passages also means that there's no vehicle access at the back, so people have to park on the street. If you can't find a spot, do what the villagers do. Blame the Norman planners.
As we've seen, the layout is no accident, and one you'll be able to spot in our oldest villages right across the country. An ancient church, a main street with its marketplace, and a manor or a castle, whether it's as big as this one or a small ruin. The Norman blueprint for bringing the population together in a meticulously planned and centralised spot was all about conquest and control. Here in Warkworth, it still resonates. Where once those privileged few burgage plot holders would take their produce up to the castle as rent, now it's not out of obligation to their lord and master, but in the hope of a prize at the village show.
I did a mixture of yellow, grey and brown.
Wow. Like many villages up and down the country, Warkworth epitomises the idyllic village scene that's so ingrained in the English sense of identity. But what we see here today is firmly laid on the foundations set by the Normans. It's an unsettling thought, but this quintessential English village is actually French.